Mike had always loved his home in the quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a place he had worked hard for, and after years of making it his own, he felt it was time for one final upgrade. His garage, while functional, was cramped and outdated. As his hobbies grew, working on cars, woodworking, and other projects, the need for more space became apparent. He dreamed of a larger, more organized garage, one that could house his growing collection of tools to car projects, and, of course, provide a bit more space for Max, his dog, who loved running around in the backyard. He had always admired the larger homes on the street, with their expansive garages that seemed to add a sense of prestige and luxury to their properties. Mike wasn't looking for anything extravagant, just a spacious, functional space that would allow him to pursue his interests without being limited by the tight quarters of his old garage. After months of planning and saving, Mike decided it was time. He sketched out a design for the new garage, nothing too crazy, but definitely larger than the one he currently had. The blueprint called for a two-car garage with small workshop area, plenty of storage, and even a little space for Max to have his own corner. It was practical and sensible, but Mike knew it would add tremendous value to his property. Excited about the idea, he submitted his plans to the HOA, as required by the community's regulations. The application process was relatively simple: submit the design, wait for approval, and if everything checked out, get started. Mike knew the rules, had followed them carefully, and didn't expect any issues. This was his home, and he was improving it within the community's standards. He imagined himself in his new garage, working on projects, organizing tools, and having a place where everything had its own spot. It wasn't just about the garage, it was about building something that would last and serve him for years to come. With the plans in hand, Mike felt a sense of anticipation. Little did he know, this simple dream of improving his home would soon turn into an unexpected battle with the HOA, a battle that would test his resolve and reshape his relationship with the community. Mike waited eagerly for the HOA's approval, confident that there would be no issues. He had carefully adhered to all the community guidelines, made sure the design fit the aesthetic of the neighborhood, and followed every rule in the book. So when the email notification finally came through, Mike was excited to see what the HOA had to say. He opened the email and read through the message. To his relief, it began with a formal acknowledgement of his submission. Mrs. Constance Pierce, the HOA president, had reviewed his plans and had no immediate concerns. In fact, she expressed her approval in the initial lines of the email, praising the clean design and layout. Mike felt a wave of relief wash over him. This was going to be smooth sailing. The email continued with the usual formalities, asking him to sign off on the document, acknowledging the terms of the project. The terms were straightforward. He had to ensure the construction would adhere to the agreed-upon design, and any alterations during the build would need to be approved by the HOA. Mike could deal with that. He was more than happy to comply. There was nothing in the email that indicated any hurdles ahead. Excited, Mike printed out the forms and signed the documents, preparing to send them back. He felt a sense of accomplishment, certain that his dream garage would soon be under construction. But as he was about to press send on his return email, he noticed a small note at the bottom of the HOA's message. It was a brief line, almost buried within the formal text. Please be aware that the community has strict regulations regarding the size of new structures. We ask that you ensure your design does not exceed the established limits. Further details will follow shortly. Mike furrowed his brow as he reread the note. He had checked the regulations multiple times before submitting his plans, and everything seemed to be within the guidelines. His garage design was larger than his current one, but not by much, and it still fit comfortably within the HOA's limits. However, the mention of strict regulations left him uneasy. What was the HOA's true concern? And why had they added that line at the end of the email? He pushed the thought aside. Surely it was just a standard reminder. After all, the approval had already been given, and no one had raised any issues with the actual size of the garage when the plans were submitted. Mike finalized his return email and hit send, convinced that everything would proceed smoothly. A few days after Mike sent back the signed approval forms, he received a letter from the HOA. This time, it wasn't an email but a thick envelope, the kind that typically signified serious business. Mike's stomach tightened as he sliced it open, half expecting a simple reminder of the terms he had already agreed to. But what he found inside was nothing short of baffling. The letter, printed on the HOA's official stationery, began with a curt greeting from Mrs. Constance Pierce. She congratulated Mike on his efforts to improve his property and expressed her appreciation for his attention to detail. But then the tone shifted. After reviewing your plans more closely, we regret to inform you that your new garage does not comply with the community's guidelines. Specifically, the size of the garage exceeds the maximum allowable dimensions for new structures in this neighborhood. This decision is in line with the standards we uphold for maintaining consistency and harmony in the area. Mike stared at the words in disbelief. His heart sank as he reread the sentence over and over again. Exceeds the allowable dimensions? The size of his garage wasn't even close to being out of line. The plans he had submitted were well within the bounds of the HOA's guidelines, and nothing in the initial approval process had indicated that there were any concerns about size. The letter continued with a formal request to revise the garage's plans to meet the community's aesthetic standards and provide a new set of updated drawings within the next 2 weeks. If Mike chose not to comply, the HOA would take further action, which could involve hefty fines or legal intervention. Mike's frustration grew. How could this be happening? He had followed the rules meticulously, and now, after receiving initial approval, the HOA was throwing up roadblocks. What was even more perplexing was Mrs. Pierce's suggestion that the garage's size didn't fit the aesthetic standards of the community. Mike had taken great care to ensure that his design blended in with the surrounding properties. He ran through the email he had received earlier. Everything seemed fine. No red flags. And yet, now the HOA was essentially telling him that his approved design was suddenly unacceptable. Mike wasn't about to just accept this. Something didn't add up, and he intended to get to the bottom of it. He immediately called a meeting with Mrs. Pierce, determined to find out exactly what had changed between the approval and this sudden opposition. Mike wasn't the type to sit back and accept vague and contradictory statements from the HOA. He had played by the rules, and now they were changing the game on him. He wasn't going to let Mrs. Pierce and the HOA board push him around, especially not after they had already given their initial approval. He picked up the phone and dialed Mrs. Pierce's number, his frustration evident as the phone rang. When she answered, her voice was as sweet as ever, though Mike could hear the underlying tension. "Mr. Miller, how can I help you today?" Mrs. Pierce's voice was syrupy, but Mike could tell she was already on the defensive. "Mrs. Pierce," Mike said, keeping his tone calm but firm, "I just received your letter about my garage, and I'm confused. The plans I submitted were approved. I received no mention of size issues at any point during that process. So why are you now telling me that my garage doesn't meet your standards?" There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Mrs. Pierce replied, her tone now more clipped. "Mr. Miller, while you may have received initial approval, our board has conducted a more thorough review, and we've determined that the size of your garage exceeds what is permitted for new constructions. We have to maintain consistency in the neighborhood, and unfortunately, this project does not align with our community's aesthetic guidelines." Mike shook his head in disbelief. "I've done my research, Mrs. Pierce. I followed the guidelines to the letter. The only thing I'm seeing here is a vague excuse and a shifting standard. Can you provide me with the specific regulations that I'm violating? And if the size is an issue, why was it approved in the first place?" There was a pause, and when Mrs. Pierce spoke again, her voice lacked the earlier confidence. "We're simply making sure the project aligns with our neighborhood standards. The board's decision is final." Mike wasn't having it. "Mrs. Pierce, I'm not going to let this go. I'm requesting a formal meeting with the board. I want to see the specifics behind this decision, and I want the entire board to explain how my garage is suddenly a problem." There was another long pause. Mike could hear her breathing, and he knew she was weighing her options. Finally, Mrs. Pierce spoke, her voice tight with controlled annoyance. "Fine. I'll arrange for the meeting. But know this, our decision stands. You will need to revise your plans, or we'll take further action. I'll be ready," Mike said, his voice resolute. "And I expect to see the full documentation and justification for your decision." He hung up the phone, a sense of determination settling over him. He was no longer going to play by their ambiguous rules. He was going to make them face the truth. His garage fit the guidelines, and he wasn't about to let them change the rules in the middle of the game. As he looked out the window, he saw the construction crew continuing their work on the garage. The structure was beginning to take shape, and Mike could feel a surge of pride. This was his project, and he was going to finish it, no matter what the HOA tried to throw at him. The day of the meeting with the HOA board arrived, and Mike was ready. He had gathered all the documentation he needed, copies of the community guidelines, his original garage plans, and even the initial approval email from Mrs. Pierce herself. He had come prepared, knowing that the HOA couldn't backpedal without facing some serious scrutiny. As Mike walked into the HOA's conference room, he noticed the board members were already seated, including Mrs. Pierce, who was perched at the head of the table with a confident smirk. The room was stuffy and formal, with walls lined with framed photos of community events and architectural guidelines. It looked like the kind of place where decisions were made with little concern for transparency or fairness. "Mr. Miller, thank you for joining us today," Mrs. Pierce said, her voice overly polite, though her tone lacked warmth. She glanced at the rest of the board, who nodded in a way that felt almost rehearsed. "We're here to discuss the issue regarding your garage, and we appreciate your willingness to meet with us." Mike nodded, keeping his composure. He had one goal in mind: to get to the bottom of why his garage, which was in compliance with the guidelines, was being blocked. He didn't waste any time. "I'd like to start by asking a simple question. Why was my garage initially approved, and why is it now being rejected?" Mike asked, his voice calm but firm. "I followed all the rules and guidelines you set out, and now I'm being told I need to revise my plans. Can you explain why?" Mrs. Pierce shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable under the direct questioning. "Well, as we stated in our previous letter, the size of your garage exceeds what is typical for new structures in this neighborhood. It's just too large, Mr. Miller." Mike didn't flinch. "I've reviewed the guidelines thoroughly. There's no mention of a specific size limit for garages in the community guidelines. What I'm seeing here is an arbitrary decision. This is not about size, it's about something else." Mike's words hung in the air, and he could see a few of the board members exchange uncomfortable glances. Mrs. Pierce tightened her grip on her pen, but she didn't answer. Instead, another board member, Mr. Johnson, spoke up. "Look, Mr. Miller, we're just trying to maintain the aesthetic appeal of the neighborhood. Your garage is, frankly, a bit much. It doesn't fit the general look of the area." "That's a subjective assessment," Mike replied, not backing down. "I've made sure my garage design follows the community's aesthetic guidelines. It blends in just fine. You approved it initially, so why the sudden change?" The room fell silent, and Mike noticed Mrs. Pierce's face reddening slightly. Something wasn't right. She wasn't giving a clear reason for rejecting his plans, and the other board members weren't exactly jumping in to support her. It became clear to Mike that they were avoiding the real issue. Before anyone could speak again, Mike leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the room. "I've done some research," he said quietly. "I know that several larger projects have been approved recently. I'm talking about new constructions that exceed my garage in both size and scale. So I have to ask, why is mine being singled out?" There was a brief pause. Mrs. Pierce's eyes narrowed, and Mike could feel the tension in the room rise. He had hit a nerve. "The truth is," Mike continued, "the real reason I'm being blocked isn't because of my garage's size or its design. It's because the HOA has a history of making deals with local contractors. Smaller projects are more profitable for them. This is about money, not community standards." The room went still. Mrs. Pierce's face tightened, and the other board members shifted uneasily in their seats. Mike had uncovered something they hadn't anticipated, a hidden agenda that went beyond rules and regulations. "I think you're being unfair to me," Mike said, his voice calm but unwavering. "This is about favoring certain contractors and businesses in the area, and I won't be a part of it. If you're going to reject my plans, I want you to be honest about it." For a moment, no one spoke. Mrs. Pierce's confident demeanor was now replaced with a hint of frustration. She could no longer hide behind vague excuses. Mike had exposed the true nature of the HOA's actions. "I'm not going to let this go," Mike continued. "I've come prepared, and if I need to take legal action to get this garage built, I will. You can't stop me just because you're protecting your business interests. I'll fight this in court if I have to." Mrs. Pierce and the board members exchanged looks, but Mike could see that their resolve was weakening. They had underestimated him. The truth was out, and the HOA's true motives were clear. Mike's words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was a heavy silence in the room. Mrs. Pierce and the rest of the HOA board exchanged nervous glances, clearly uncomfortable with the revelations Mike had just made. Mike's determination was evident, and he wasn't going to let the HOA get away with their underhanded tactics. After what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Pierce spoke again, her voice strained. "Mr. Miller, this is not how we typically handle things. We don't appreciate these accusations, and we certainly don't appreciate being publicly challenged like this. However, I must remind you that the HOA's authority is final, And if you choose to ignore our request to modify the garage, we will take action. Mike sat up straighter, meeting her gaze head-on. I'm not backing down, Mrs. Pierce. I know what you're doing, and I won't let you use the HOA as a means to line your pockets at the expense of the community. I've done nothing wrong. You approved my plans. Now you're trying to bully me into complying with rules that don't even exist. Mike could see that Mrs. Pierce was trying to regain her composure, but it was too late. He had exposed their motives, and there was no turning back now. The other board members remained silent, some looking uncomfortable, others clearly divided. Mike realized that most of them were probably unaware of the shady dealings that had been going on under their noses. He took a deep breath and continued. I've had enough of this, and I'm not going to let you intimidate me. I will fight back. I'll take this to court if I have to, and I'm not alone. I've already spoken to some of the other homeowners who feel the same way. You can't keep pushing people around just because you have power over them. The room fell silent once again. Mike's words were a challenge, not just to Mrs. Pierce, but to the entire board. For the first time, the HOA wasn't in control of the situation. Mike wasn't just fighting for his garage anymore. He was fighting for every homeowner who had silently suffered under the HOA's unfair practices. Mrs. Pierce's mask of control finally slipped. She was visibly flustered, unsure of how to proceed. This is unacceptable, she muttered. The HOA board will review your statement, Mr. Miller, but we will not allow you to disregard the community standards. This matter is far from over. Mike stood up, ready to leave. I'm not ignoring community standards, Mrs. Pierce. I'm simply asking that you follow the same standards you apply to everyone else. You've shown your true colors today, and I won't back down. As Mike walked out of the room, he felt a sense of empowerment. The fight wasn't over, but he knew he had taken the first crucial step in taking control of the situation. The HOA's bullying tactics weren't going to work on him, and he wasn't afraid to go to war with them if that's what it took. Back at home, Mike sat down at his desk, gathering his thoughts. He knew this battle would be long and difficult, but he was ready. The legal fight would be the next step, but he also knew he needed to rally support from his neighbors. It was clear to him now that this wasn't just about one man and his garage. It was about standing up to an unjust system that had too much power over people's lives. With renewed determination, Mike decided to start gathering support for a community-wide effort to hold the HOA accountable. He reached out to neighbors he knew had been frustrated with the HOA's rules, some who had quietly dealt with unfair fines and arbitrary demands in the past. It was time to unite. Mike knew that the HOA had underestimated him, but he wasn't going to let them continue their reign of control. With a solid legal case, a growing group of supporters, and his unshakable resolve, he was ready to take on the HOA headfirst. With a renewed sense of purpose, Mike set his plan into motion. The HOA had made a critical mistake. They had underestimated his resolve, and now he wasn't just going to build a new garage, he was going to build a statement. A garage that would be bigger, bolder, and more impressive than anything the HOA had anticipated. It was time to show them who had the real power in this situation. Mike called his contractor, Steve, and explained his decision. I'm not just going to build the garage we originally planned. We're going bigger. I want a structure that will make them think twice before they try to mess with me again, Mike said, his voice firm. Steve paused for a moment, clearly taken aback. Bigger? You sure about that? I mean, we're talking about something substantially larger. It might get the HO riled up even more. Mike's jaw tightened. Exactly. Let them get riled up. I'm done being pushed around. I'm building something that'll make them regret ever crossing me. After discussing the details, Mike and Steve decided on a new plan. They would still keep the garage's overall design in line with the neighborhood's aesthetic, but expand the footprint, adding an extra storage loft, larger workspaces, and even a small office area. The garage would become a multifunctional space, something more impressive than anything the HOA had ever seen. And the best part, it would still comply with every single guideline the HOA had set, leaving them with no legal ground to stand on. Construction began quickly, and Mike could feel the excitement building within him. The foundation was poured first, and as the structure began to take shape, he found himself feeling more confident with each passing day. The garage was growing taller, broader, and more striking with each piece that was added. Mike made sure the design had all the right touches, sleek lines, a modern roofline, and a layout that would fit seamlessly with the rest of the homes on the block. As the construction crew put up the frame and walls, Mike stood back and admired the progress. It was already starting to look like something special, a space that was not only functional, but a real statement piece. Word began to spread throughout the neighborhood. Neighbors, who had been wary of the HOA's power, started to take notice. Some of them watched from their windows. Others came by to see the progress up close. There was an unmistakable energy in the air. Mike wasn't the only one who felt this fight was about more than just one man's garage. This was about taking a stand against the HOA's petty, overbearing tactics. One morning, as Mike was checking in on the progress, he noticed a few neighbors gathered outside, talking excitedly. He walked over to join them, his hands in his pockets, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "You've got the HOA scared, Mike," one of the neighbors, Greg, said, giving him a thumbs up. "Everyone around here is talking about it. The place is going to look amazing, and I think it's time someone gave that HOA a taste of its own medicine." Mike nodded, feeling the support of the community solidify. It's not just about the garage. It's about making sure they know they can't dictate our lives. They'll have to answer for this. The construction continued steadily, and soon the garage was starting to take its final shape. The expansive windows, the double-wide doors, and the towering structure all combined to make it a standout feature on the block. It was clear that this wasn't just any garage, it was a symbol of defiance, a statement of Mike's unwillingness to let the HOA dictate what he could do on his own property. As the final touches were added, Mike stood in front of the almost completed garage, looking up at it with pride. The construction was finished. This was his new space, and it was everything he had envisioned and more. Now, the HOA would have to make a decision. Would they continue to stand in the way of something that clearly met the guidelines? Or would they back down, knowing that Mike wasn't someone they could easily intimidate? The garage was complete, and Mike felt an overwhelming sense of pride as he stood in front of it. It was more than just a garage. It was a statement, a defiant declaration that he wouldn't let anyone, especially the HOA, tell him how to live on his own property. But now the real challenge was about to begin. The HOA had to respond to what he had built, and Mike knew it wasn't going to be pretty. It didn't take long for the HOA to send their first official response. Mike was sitting at his kitchen table when a thick envelope arrived, stamped with the HOA's logo. His heart sank as he picked it up, knowing exactly what was inside. As he opened the letter, the familiar words jumped off the page. Mrs. Constance Pierce had signed it, and her tone was as cold and dismissive as ever. The letter began with a formal acknowledgement of the new structure, but the words that followed made Mike's blood boil. "Dear Mr. Miller," the letter began, "we are writing to formally address the recent construction of your new garage. After a thorough review, we regret to inform you that your structure exceeds the allowed dimensions and does not comply with the HOA's guidelines. The size, materials, and overall design deviate significantly from community standards. As a result, we are requesting that you immediately begin the process of removing the structure or significantly reducing its size." Mike's eyes narrowed as he read further. The letter went on to say that he would be fined for the violations and that the HOA would take legal action if he refused to comply. Mrs. Pierce even included a reminder of the consequences for ignoring the HOA's demands, warning him that further escalation could lead to costly fines and potentially a court case. Mike felt a surge of anger rise within him. The HOA wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. They were threatening him with legal action simply because he had dared to stand up to them. The structure was well within the guidelines. They just didn't like the fact that he had built something impressive, something that didn't fall in line with their narrow vision for the neighborhood. He put the letter down and stood up, pacing the room. He could feel the weight of their opposition, but at the same time, he was more determined than ever. They had pushed him too far, and now he wasn't going to back down. The next day, Mike went to the neighborhood to take a look at the responses from his neighbors. As he walked around, he saw many of them looking at his garage, some nodding with approval. Greg, the neighbor who had supported him early on, approached him with a smile. "You've got them rattled, Mike," Greg said, giving him a friendly slap on the back. "The HOA's been talking about taking legal action. But everyone around here loves what you did. You've got the whole block behind you." Mike smiled, grateful for the support, but he knew it wasn't enough. The HOA wasn't just going to roll over. They would keep pressing, and Mike needed to be prepared for the next battle. He wasn't going to let them win. That evening, Mike sat down with his legal team, preparing for the next step. He wasn't about to remove his garage or shrink its size. The HOA had made a mistake, and he was going to make sure they realized it. As the days passed, Mike could feel the tide beginning to turn. While the HOA's threats hung over him like a dark cloud, the support from his neighbors grew stronger with each passing day. Word had spread quickly through the community about the HOA's unfair stance, and many homeowners, who had silently dealt with the HOA's overreaching tactics in the past, were now stepping forward to show their support for Mike. It started with small gestures, people giving him knowing nods when he walked his dog, Max, through the neighborhood. Then, it was more than just silent solidarity. Greg, the neighbor who had spoken with him earlier, was the first to approach him with something concrete. "I've been talking to a few people around here, Mike," Greg said one afternoon, looking over his shoulder to make sure no one was eavesdropping. "You're not the only one fed up with how things are run around here. The HOA has been harassing people for years, but no one had the guts to stand up to them. You've got a lot of support, more than you realize." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying people are willing to take action?" Greg smiled, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Absolutely. We've been looking for a way to challenge the HO, but we didn't know how. Now that you're doing it, we'll back you up. Some of us have had enough with the fines for trivial things like lawn care, mailboxes, and even the paint on our houses. It's time someone did something about it." Mike's heart swelled with a sense of relief. The weight of this battle wasn't on his shoulders alone anymore. It was becoming clear that he wasn't just fighting for his garage, he was fighting for the community's right to be treated fairly. This wasn't just about one man and his garage. It was about standing up to an unjust system that had been silently controlling the neighborhood for far too long. The next day, Mike received a petition that had been circulating around the block. It was a simple document, but its impact was powerful. It called for an end to the HOA's excessive fines and unfair treatment of homeowners. The petition had already garnered signatures from nearly half the neighborhood, and it was growing fast. Mike read through it carefully. Neighbors were fed up with the HOA's selective enforcement of rules, their lack of transparency, and their disregard for the well-being of the people they were supposed to represent. Many had been hesitant to speak up before, but now with Mike leading the charge, they felt empowered to take action. The petition didn't just support Mike's garage, it called for a complete overhaul of the HOA's practices. Mike knew this was the perfect opportunity to hit the HOA where it hurt, their reputation. If they were going to drag him into court, they were going to have to deal with the collective will of the entire neighborhood. Mike felt a surge of energy. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. The support of the community was a game changer. He had gathered his legal team and was ready to present the HOA with not only a legal challenge over the garage but a full-blown resistance from the residents who were tired of being silenced. A few days later, Mike called another meeting with Mrs. Pierce and the HOA board. This time, he wasn't coming alone. Mike walked into the HOA meeting with a newfound sense of confidence. The weight of the petition, the signatures of dozens of supportive neighbors, and the backing of his legal team made him feel as if he had a powerful force behind him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the whole community standing up against an authoritarian system that had run unchecked for too long. As he entered the meeting room, Mrs. Pierce's eyes met his, but there was no longer that air of superiority she had once exuded. Instead, there was an underlying sense of discomfort, as if she knew that this fight wasn't going to go the way she expected. The other board members were there as well, their faces a mix of apprehension and forced calm. "I see you brought reinforcements this time, Mr. Miller," Mrs. Pierce said coolly, her voice trying, but failing to hide the tension. "I assume you're here to discuss the same issue, the garage that's too big," she added, her words dripping with sarcasm. Mike took a deep breath, standing tall and composed. He wasn't intimidated anymore. "Actually, Mrs. Pierce, I'm here to address the bigger issue. It's no longer just about my garage. It's about the way the HOA has been overstepping its boundaries and unfairly targeting homeowners for years." Mike gestured to the stack of papers he placed on the table, a copy of the petition, a list of signatures, and a detailed breakdown of the legal issues surrounding the HOA's actions. "This," he continued, "is a petition signed by almost half the homeowners in this community. They're all demanding change. They want transparency, fairness, and for the HOA to stop targeting people with arbitrary fines and restrictions." Mrs. Pierce's expression faltered for a split second, but she quickly regained her composure. "This is absurd, Mr. Miller. You're going to turn the entire neighborhood against us over a few small issues," she scoffed. "We're just trying to maintain order and protect the integrity of this community." "Order," Mike repeated, his voice calm but firm. "You've been using order as an excuse to control people's lives. There's nothing fair about selective enforcement of rules. You've been making money off homeowners' misery, and we're done with it. He slid a folder across the table to Mrs. Pierce. Inside, there were copies of emails from HOA board members, communications with contractors, and evidence of financial discrepancies, all pointing to a pattern of favoritism and financial gain by the HOA's leadership. Mike had spent the past week digging through the HOA's public records, and what he uncovered was damning. "I think this will be of interest to you," Mike said, locking eyes with Mrs. Pierce. "You've been accepting kickbacks from contractors who benefit from the smaller projects you've been approving in the neighborhood. Meanwhile, you've been blocking larger projects like mine to keep the prices lower for your business associates. That's not just unethical, it's illegal." For a moment, there was silence in the room as everyone processed what Mike had just said. Mrs. Pierce's face turned pale, her confident facade now crumbling. The other board members exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that the walls were closing in. "Mr. Miller," Mrs. Pierce finally said, her voice shakier than before, "this is all hearsay. You have no proof of these accusations." Mike smiled, the calm certainty in his demeanor now completely evident. "I have everything I need. And now the neighborhood knows what's been going on. If you don't want this to escalate to a full investigation, I suggest you rethink your position. You have until the end of this week to resolve this issue, or I'll take it to the media. I'll make sure everyone knows how you've been running this HOA." The room went quiet again, this time with the weight of Mike's words hanging heavily over everyone present. Mike stood up, gathering the documents, but not before looking directly at Mrs. Pierce. "If you want to avoid a scandal that could ruin the HOA's reputation and lead to legal consequences, I'd suggest a formal apology and a full review of your practices," Mike said, his voice resolute. "Otherwise, we'll take the next steps." As Mike turned and walked toward the door, he could hear the board members whispering in hushed tones, clearly rattled by the evidence he had laid out before them. He didn't need to hear what they were saying. The expression on their faces told him everything. They were on the defensive now. The next few days were filled with anticipation as Mike waited for the HOA to respond. The atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted dramatically. Word had spread about the meeting and the bombshell that Mike had dropped. The residents were buzzing with excitement, and many were eager to see how the HOA would react. Mike received a call early one morning, and as he recognized the number, his heart skipped a beat. It was Mrs. Pierce. He had expected the HOA to push back harder, but he wasn't prepared for what she had to say. "Mr. Miller, I'm calling to inform you that the HOA board has decided to meet your demands." Mrs. Pierce's voice was surprisingly calm, but there was an edge of defeat in it. "We are rescinding the fines, and your garage will be allowed to stay as is. We also acknowledge the need for a review of our policies, and will begin the process of restructuring some of our outdated rules." Mike's heart raced, but he kept his tone steady. "I'm glad to hear that, Mrs. Pierce, but I want this to be an official statement. Not just words. The HOA needs to commit to real changes, transparent rules, fair enforcement, and no more favoritism toward contractors." Mrs. Pierce sighed. "I understand, Mr. Miller. The board has agreed to hold a community-wide meeting in the next week to discuss these changes. We'll also be appointing an independent committee to oversee the review of our guidelines. This process will be more transparent, as you requested. We'll also be issuing an apology to you for the way this was handled." Mike paused, processing her words. This was a huge victory, not just for him, but for every homeowner in the community who had been fed up with the HOA's oppressive tactics. He wasn't naive. He knew that the HOA might try to regain control eventually, but this was a significant first step. And with the support of the neighborhood, Mike wasn't going to let them forget what had happened. "Thank you, Mrs. Pierce," Mike said, his voice resolute. "But remember, this isn't just about my garage. It's about changing the way the HOA operates. If you're truly committed to making those changes, then follow through. I'll be watching." As the call ended, Mike felt a wave of relief wash over him. The battle had been long and exhausting, but it had paid off. The HOA had finally caved to pressure, not just from him, but from the entire neighborhood. He had exposed the flaws in their system, and now it was time for real change. That evening, Mike called a meeting with his neighbors to share the news. He walked into the room to a round of applause, the faces of his neighbors glowing with pride and excitement. "You did it, Mike," Greg said, clapping him on the back. "We did it." Mike smiled, feeling the weight of the past weeks lift off his shoulders. "This isn't just my win. It's all of ours. We're not going to let the HOA push us around anymore. But we need to keep pushing for fairness and transparency. This is only the beginning. The neighbors nodded, their faces full of determination. They had seen what Mike could do when he stood up for what was right. Now they were ready to stand with him. The meeting was filled with discussion about next steps, how to ensure the HOA followed through on their promises, and how to continue advocating for fairness in the neighborhood. But Mike knew one thing for certain: they had turned the tide. The HOA could no longer operate unchecked. The power had shifted, and the residents were now the ones in control. Weeks passed after the HOA's official reversal of their decision, and Mike could see the changes taking shape. The board held the promised community meeting, and as Mike stood at the front of the room with his neighbors, it was clear that the atmosphere had shifted. There were no more hushed conversations in the corner or whispered complaints about the HOA's overreach. Now the residents spoke openly, with Mike leading the charge for reform. The meeting was a success, but the real victory lay in the tangible changes that followed. The HOA, once known for its secrecy and selective enforcement, was now operating with a new sense of transparency. They posted their decision-making process online, made financial records available to homeowners, and introduced clear guidelines that were consistent and fair. The community was now in the loop, and the HOA no longer wielded its power in a way that left people feeling helpless. Mike, who had spent years dreaming of a peaceful home, found that peace had returned to the neighborhood, not just in the form of his garage, but in the confidence that the HOA would no longer overstep its boundaries. The ongoing community involvement gave everyone a sense of ownership in how their neighborhood was governed. It felt like a victory for everyone, not just those who had rallied behind Mike. As the weeks turned into months, Mike continued to monitor the HOA's actions, ensuring they stuck to their word. But he also found himself with a new role in the neighborhood: an advocate, a watchdog, and a symbol of what could happen when a community stood together. One evening, as Mike worked in his spacious new garage, he reflected on everything that had led him to this point. The garage wasn't just a place to store tools or work on projects anymore. It was a symbol of resilience and the fight for what was right. And when he looked out into the neighborhood, he knew that his decision to stand up to the HOA had sparked something bigger than just one man's desire for a bigger garage. It had changed the entire neighborhood's mindset about standing up for their rights. Max, his ever-faithful dog, lay beside him, content and relaxed. The two of them had made it through the ordeal together, and Mike couldn't help but smile as he watched Max nap, knowing the battles they had fought together were behind them. The HOA had tried to push him around, but Mike had built something bigger than just a structure. He had built a community that refused to be intimidated. And as the sun set over the neighborhood, Mike knew that the future was bright. The power had shifted, and it was no longer in the hands of the HOA. It was in the hands of the residents, who had learned the power of unity and standing up for what was right.